We are now recording and everyone is out the chat. Okay. So, welcome to ODSECS 20, which is a milestone day as we celebrate the collegiality and community that allows scholarly societies. Okay, that was right. Sorry, I don't know what that was. Go back. Allow scholarly societies and seminar series such as this and genuine intellectual endeavor to flourish in the face of so much gatekeeping and bureaucracy designed to turn us into competitors rather than colleagues. Hosting ODSECS this year has been an absolute delight and a feast for my brain. I'd like to thank all of our speakers and all of our attendees, both live and those who catch up or review on YouTube. So without further preamble, I'd like to introduce today's introducer. Dr. Joseph Hone is a fellow in English literature at Newcastle University. His research explores the underground book trade, the poetry of Swift and Pope, political thought, and intellectual history. His publications include essays, chapters, books, and creative nonfiction on all of the above, including the 2021 OUP book, Alexander Pope in the Making, which is so good it made me, the captain of Team Sibber, appreciate Pope, which is no small undertaking. Joe is going to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Ross Carroll, and I'm going to re-drop a copy of the accessibility copy into the chat for those who came in late.
Thanks, Elaine. Panegyric worthy of Dryden. It's a real pleasure to be able to introduce Ross Carroll as our speaker today. Ross is a senior lecturer in political theory at the University of Exeter, and he's the author of some really astonishing, I think really important new work in 18th century studies as conceived in an interdisciplinary way. It's got much broader implications for those of us working in literary studies, cultural history, the history of philosophy. Most notably, he's the author of the book Uncivil Mirth, Ridicule in Enlightenment Britain, which came out of Princeton last year. And it made a real splash, not just for the way we think about people like Shaftesbury and Hume and Wollstonecraft, but also for the way that it connected the history of political thought with the present day. But without ever losing that rich sense of historical context. So in my view, it's a real model of how to go about the kind of scholarship that can link the past with the present. Today, Ross will, I'm sure, be continuing in that vein with a paper entitled A Code Noir for the British West Indies, placing Edmund Burke's sketch for a Negro Code in context. And thank you again, Ross, for joining us. Over to you.
Lovely, thank you, Joe. I'm just going to share some slides. Now, is that okay? Good, okay. Oh, hang on. If I switch.
You switch displays like we did before.
Yes, that's what I need to do. Hang on. There we go. Is that okay? Oh, it needs to go the other way. Is that right? Like that? No? No.
Is it use slideshow, I think?
Oh, that might be the issue. Yeah. Yes, that might be the issue. Okay. How's that? No, I can't see anybody, but.
So I'm not getting your screen, Ross.
Ah, okay. Not now either?
No.
It's not now. This did work in practice.
It did. It worked perfect.
Yeah. Okay. We will get there. Anything now?
Yeah, we can still see the notes and
notes. Okay. Yeah, I prefer not.
Perfect.
Now it's perfect. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I think my notes are to my right now, so then my head might be tilted for some of the talk. Okay. Thank you so much, first of all, to Elaine for inviting me, and to Joe for that very generous introduction. I work in a politics department, so I feel a little bit like an interloper, but I'm really delighted that I can be part of an 18th century studies conversation. I think that's something I want to do more of as I go forward. So today's topic came to me back in 2020 when what you see in front of you happened. So this was the moment during global anti-racism protests inspired by the Black Lives Matter movements in the United States. The statue of Edward Colston was toppled and tossed into the River Avon, which is about an hour from where I'm standing now in the city of Bristol. Now, Edward Colston, as many of you will recall, was a MP for Bristol, but also someone who profited massively from the transatlantic slave trade. And indeed, he used his slave fortune to endow several institutions around the city of Bristol, which was one of the principal ports in the British trade. Now, when Colston, if you like, ended up in the Avon, my thoughts turned to another MP for Bristol and another statue, which is about half a mile away, a statue of Edmund Burke. And I had thought for a moment, I wonder if Burke is going to be next. And then it quickly transpired that he wasn't going to be. And that was largely because it seemed to me, at least, that the public perception of Burke was either of someone who had little to say about slavery at all, because he was more preoccupied with things like the French Revolution or the war with America and so on, or as someone who was, broadly speaking, anti-slavery, opposed the trade and wished for its demise. So that was the sort of the popular sense around Burke. And it made me want to know more about what he actually said about slavery and what his actual plans for reforming the slave trade were. Okay, so I want to start, if you don't mind, with a poem, or at least the final stanza of a poem written by the Irish Quaker Mary Leadbeater. So this is a poem called The Negro, addressed to Edmund Burke. By the way, 18th century writers often use the term Negro to describe Black people. I will only use the term in the context of quoting in this presentation. O thou this country's boast, this age's pride, freedom's firm friend and pity's generous guide, great Burke, whose voice when wretchedness complains, humanity's invaded rights maintains. Hark, nature speaks in injured Afric's right, and deeds of horror are disclosed to light. That wert not silent that important day, on such a theme thou couldst not silence stay. Now, in this poem, Leadbeater was praising Burke for the uncompromising stance that he took against the slave trade in 1789. Now, Leadbeater knew Burke personally and was likely well acquainted with his views on slavery. Her grandfather, Abraham Shackleton, had been Burke's schoolmaster at his school in Ballator in County Kildare. And he himself had been involved in various abolitionist campaigns. He was committed to the boycott of sugar, tea, and other products of slave labor. So there is an abolitionist current in Burke's early life that Leadbeater, I think, was tapping into. Now, the important day that Leadbeater mentions fell during the May 1798 debate in Parliament over William Wilberforce's proposals to end the slave trade. So on May 12th, Burke rose to condemn the slave trade as, quote, so horrid that not a single argument could be heard in its favor. Now, this included any argument concerning the economic impact of a cessation of the trade. If investors lost capital because of abolition, Burke argued, then too bad for them. They had known what they were entering into, he reasoned, and their capital could now be redirected to less detestable forms of economic activity. So pretty uncompromising stuff. Burke, however, had not always denounced the trade so forcibly. In the early stages of his career, his repugnance for slavery was tempered by his enthusiasm for West Indian commerce and his opposition to parliamentary infringement on the rights of the chartered companies most heavily involved in trading slaves. So as P.J. Marshall has recently shown, Burke played an influential role in one of the Rockingham administration's principal pieces of legislation, the Free Ports Act of 1766, one effect of which was a massive increase in the number of slaves transported from Africa to Jamaica and Dominica. Essentially, it made several new free ports in those islands, which dramatically reduced the tariffs on slaves, and so it made them much cheaper to import. Later, Burke went out of his way to support the slave interest by lobbying on behalf of the Company of the Merchants of Africa, or the Royal African Company. So in May 1772, he defended the company's directors from charges of mismanagement. He urged Parliament to subsidize the cost of fortifications on the West African coast. And he even cited their success at increasing slave shipments year on year as evidence of the company's efficiency. Notably, Burke's involvement with the African Company predated his election as MP for the slave port of Bristol by 2 years, suggesting that this was more than just an unfortunate compromise needed to advance his constituents' interest. This is often the line that is used to sort of, if you like, excuse Burke's early defense of the Royal African Company. They'd say he was an MP for Bristol and so bound, but not true. This predates his time as MP. So in light of the above, a lot of scholars have now started to regard Burke's embrace of abolitionism in 1789 as an aberration, particularly as Burke reverted to a preference for slave trade reform in the 1790s, when abolition became intertwined with the politics of the French Revolution. So in the first study of Burke's views on Africa, Benedict Durr concluded that Burke's, quote, concern and sympathy for the African slave had been momentary. More recently, by contrast, Gregory Collins has made the case that Burke's desire to see the end of the slave trade was sincere, principled, and dated back to at least 1780, placing him effectively in the vanguard of the abolitionist movement. Now, both sides in this debate have centered their attention on the following document, right, the Sketch for a Negro Code, which is a comprehensive list of measures, it's about 72 articles, measures to regulate the slave trade that Burke drafted in 1780, but shelved until 1792, when he finally circulated it among his parliamentary peers. So although he was very early in writing it, he didn't do much with it until the 1790s. Now, for Collins, the sketch not only demonstrates Burke's repugnance for slavery and his sensitivity to slave suffering, it also constituted one of the first plans produced in Britain for both gradual abolition of the trade and manumission of the enslaved. More skeptical readers, such as Dan O'Neill, have drawn the opposite conclusion about the sketch. Burke's plan, O'Neill maintains, aimed at perpetuating the trade rather than ending it, by basically showing how it could be rendered more humane and sustainable. Now, what I want to argue today is that reading the sketch as either abolitionist or pro-slavery is interpretively limiting. To fully gauge the scope and purpose of Burke's plan, I want to suggest we have to put it, we have to extend rather, the global and imperial contexts in which we situate it. So Burke's sketch, I want to say, is best regarded as an effort to improve upon regulatory regimes for the slave trade already in place in the Spanish and French empires. Regimes that aimed both at quelling planter abuse or master abuse and tightly regulating the lives of the enslaved. As such, rather than presaging an inevitable transition to emancipation and a post-slavery empire, the sketch prioritized the reform of the trade, improving the living conditions of the enslaved, and reining in rogue planters. That, I think, is the basic aim behind it. Now, I want to start, or continue at least, with a little bit of context, right? So, towards the end of the 18th century, British reformers, those which wish to see a reform of the slave trade, were increasingly exasperated at the legal and regulatory vacuum within which British slavers traded. And they started looking to other slaveholding states, particularly France and Spain, for models of how the institution could be rendered more humane. So in the French case, the relevant statutory instrument was this document you see before you, the Code Noir, a set of rules governing slavery in the French Empire that was most likely authored by Jean-Baptiste Colbert, first minister to Louis XIV in 1685. Now, in some respects, the Code Noir was very unpromising as a template for slave trade reform, not least because many, if not most, of its articles mandated harsh disciplinary measures for the slaves themselves, rather than reining in the abusive behaviors of masters. Nonetheless, by placing legal obligations on masters to provide nourishment, shelter, education, reduce punishment, and so on to the enslaved, it went further towards improving their condition than anything comparable in British colonial law. And that's why reformers looked to it as a model. Now, I think it is highly likely that Burke looked to the Code Noir as his model when he was composing his own sketch for a Negro Code. I mean, the very fact that he calls it a code would suggest some influence from the Code Noir. And what's more, Burke greatly admired Jean-Baptiste Colbert, and he was particularly impressed by Colbert's commercial and imperial policies, these policies that made Louis XIV's France such a great power. Now, Burke even identified the Code Noir as a promising template for slave trade reform in one of his first publications, the account of the European settlements in America, a work that he co-authored with his friend William Burke in 1757. There he praised the French for not abandoning their slaves to, quote, the discretion of the planter, while also preserving the colony from the ill effects that might arise if slaves were treated with, quote, a lenity not suited to their condition. So in this respect, Burke found that the Code Noir struck a balance between what he called the humanity and good sense. He thought it was a just and sensible mixture of humanity and steadiness, right? So, and this mixture, I think, is one that Burke himself would try to emulate in his own code. Now, as Matthew Wyman McCarthy has recently shown, British reformers showed little interest in examining whether the slave protections contained in the Code Noir were actually enforced or not. In reality, of course, they were not enforced nearly as much as the French would like to pretend. Often they were content, the reformers I mean, to treat the text of the Code Noir as a reliable indicator of French colonial reality. And this was the case even among reformers with extensive experience in the West Indies. So the Scottish reformer who you see here, James Ramsay, he had spent several years on British naval vessels in the West Indies. He had been a chaplain on the island of St. Kitts in the West Indies. And yet when he came to write his essay on the treatment and conversion of African slaves, which is a hugely influential text, he essentially applauded the French for their success in instituting a more humane legal regime for slaves in their empire. In other words, he sort of bought into the myth, really, that France was a uniquely benevolent slaveholding power. The Code Noir, Ramsay found, had placed limits on planter cruelty that, quote, put British negligence to shame. So there's this kind of shaming operation going on where these reformers are saying, look, the French and Spanish, who we so often criticize, they're ahead of the game, if you like, in terms of instituting humane reforms for slavery, whereas Britain had not. Spanish regulations also proved attractive to British reformers. So the author of this text you see before you, the Essays Commercial and Political of 1777, praised the Spanish regulations which permitted enslaved people to purchase their freedom over time at a reduced rate. Now, I'm going to talk about that a bit later. And the author of this text berated the English for lagging behind, appealing simultaneously to the black legend of Spanish cruelty and the myth of Spanish mildness towards their enslaved populations. So he says at one point, "Shall the English, ever famed with courage and humanity, which always go hand in hand, be outdone in the latter by a nation, that is Spain, in many instances notorious for cruelty?" So this is the black legend of Spanish cruelty going all the way back to the Reformation. Now, even Ottobah Cugoano, himself, of course, a former slave, he also bought into this to an extent. So he castigated the anti-abolitionist James Tobin, who had been a critic of Ramsay, because Tobin had suggested that slavery was milder in the British Empire than in the French or Spanish empires, and Cogano thought otherwise. But for Cogano, of course, the mildness or not of slavery was almost beside the point, because he just detested the institution as a whole and wished for it to end. Now, that these codes presumed the continuation of slavery and the slave trade did not dampen the determination of British reformers to emulate them. So although these are not abolitionist documents, it would be crazy to call the Code Noir an abolitionist document, but nevertheless, slave trade reformers seized upon it. So as Belby Porteous, the Bishop of London, and one of Ramsay's closest sponsors put it, a British equivalent of the Code Noir would be regarded by the enslaved as, quote, a great charter, not of their liberties, but of certain grants and privileges which they should have a right to claim, and of which it should not be in the power of a cruel and oppressive master to deprive them. Now, Porteous chose his words carefully here. The provisions on slave treatment in a British code should not approximate the liberties reserved for free subjects of the British Crown. Instead, what Porteous and other reformers envisaged was a common set of legal standards for treating enslaved people, most of whom would never aspire to civic equality with whites, but who were nevertheless entitled to a minimum of safety, nourishment, and religious education. Indeed, conversion of Africans is at the forefront of the minds of many of these reformers. Before the enslaved could, quote, enjoy the blessings of religion, Porteous argued, they needed first to experience some of the blessings of society and of civil government. And I think it was precisely to accomplish this partial extension of social and political life to the enslaved that Burke composed his sketch. Okay, so I want to turn now to the actual content of Burke's plan. So, commenting on the Code Noir, the historian Malik Gotcham noted that regardless of what its framers intended, the Code Noir combined, quote, emmanumative and repressive policies. And I want to suggest that the same is largely true of Burke's sketch for a Negro Code, particularly in its provisions concerning three things: slave protection, marriage, and manumission. So I'm going to talk about each of these in turn. So let's start with slave protection. So according to Burke's sketch, the power of masters over their slaves should be curtailed by a new office or authority that he called the, quote, protector of Negroes. And this is an office comparable to the protector of slaves that was found in both French and Spanish empires. So there's, again, I think, the influence of these other legal regimes. As Christina Twomey has written, the office of protector within imperial governance was fundamentally ambiguous, standing, quote, at the crossroads between humanitarian sentiment, state power, and the colonial project. Now, as Burke envisaged his version of the office, the enslaved would be able to hear complaints, or rather make complaints to the protector against their masters, and then the protector would be able to seek redress on their behalf. This differed a little bit from the Spanish Empire, where slaves could actually bring cases themselves to courts against their masters. In Burke's vision, it's the protector who does this on their behalf. So, for example, a beating of more than 13 lashes on Burke's plan could warrant an actionable complaint against a master through this mechanism. The protector would also appoint inspectors who would conduct biannual visitations in the colonies. And in some cases, the protector could even arrange for the transfer of abused slaves to other masters. And this, I think, reflects Burke's knowledge of the Spanish system of pedir papel, which is essentially a process where maltreated slaves could petition for new owners. Right, so you're getting abused by your master, you can petition a court to be transferred to a different owner. Now, the remit of the protector, however, was to be strictly limited on Burke's plan. So Burke made clear that the existence of this office should not, for example, excite any, quote, unreasonable hopes among the enslaved or compromise the proper authority of the overseer. Now, unusual in Burke's plan was that the protector of Negroes was also entitled to exercise authority over the manumitted Black population. So this is a unique part of Burke's plan. The protector even had the power to re-enslave any freedman twice convicted of, quote, idleness, drunkenness, quarreling, gaming, or vagrancy. Formal servitude, in other words, would be replaced by an alternative regime of social discipline that more closely resembled a form of parole than emancipation. This distinguished his approach from both the Code Noir and other reform proposals. So, for example, under Article 57 of the Code Noir, the manumitted or the affranchis were deemed to possess all the rights enjoyed by other subjects of the French Empire. In other words, the act of manumission on the Code Noir was deemed the functional equivalent of birth on French soil. So you became a French subject with all the rights of a French subject when you were manumitted. There was no risk of re-enslavement, unlike on Burke's plan. Burke's reforms also departed from the Code Noir in terms of the obligations shouldered by the manumitted. So although the Code Noir extended full rights to the manumitted as French, it also stipulated that they owed particular respect to their formal masters. So Article 58, for example, of the Code Noir commanded harsh punishments for freemen who insulted their former masters. So there's this kind of still a retention of some kind of deference towards the former master. Notable in Burke's plan is the replacement of mandatory respect towards former masters with a general prohibition on public offensiveness. So the manumitted were liable for re-enslavement for offenses that had nothing to do with their former masters. White colonial society as a whole would serve as the new overseer. Okay, I just want to say a few words about marriage in Burke's plan. Okay, so a chief worry among slave trade reformers was that curtailing the trade would starve planters of their labor force and so prompt unrest and resistance among white colonialists. Now, anticipating this difficulty, Burke's plan foresaw the reproduction of the slave population for generations after the trade's demise. So far from encouraging the implosion of plantation slavery, Burke's regulations pointed to how masters could replenish depleted slave stock by incentivizing slaves to marry and have children, because those children would be regarded as enslaved themselves. So the argument that imported slaves could be replaced by those born into slavery in the colonies had been a staple of reformist argument in the late 18th century. So James Ramsay, the Scot I mentioned earlier, he complained that instead of allowing slaves to, quote, increase in the course of nature, planters have been making, quote, constant demands on the slave market. In the same year, James White's hints for a specific plan for an abolition of the slave trade similarly envisaged the gradual replacement of imported slaves with plantation-born slaves. So White even proposed a system of fines to ensure a balance in the enslaved population between men and women, the better to facilitate reproduction. So the vast majority of slaves imported were men, and White thought that any planter discovered not to have, quote, one black woman for every enslaved man should pay a tax of 20 shillings for each woman deficient. Right? That was his suggestion. Thomas Clarkson, who's a very prominent figure in the abolition movement, he was similarly dismayed at how slow plantation owners had been to spot the advantages that lay in replacing traded slaves with those born on their own plantations. Now, for some reformers, the benefits of this homeborn slave labor were so obvious that population growth should be encouraged by whatever means every means possible. But whereas White had proposed sanctions on planters to ensure a gender balance, others favored mixing inducements and sanctions on the enslaved themselves to encourage marriage and births. So Bishop Porteous, again, proposed offering rewards to married slaves, and he even hinted that freedom could be offered as a prize to, quote, the mothers of large families. In cases where slaves were already in polygamous marriages, by contrast, Porteous thought it necessary to dissolve these unions by force if necessary. And to do this essentially by having the husband choose, quote, his most beloved among his wives to form a future monogamous marriage. For Porteous, it was essential that couples already in monogamous marriages not be separated. This is a practice that he condemned as a cruel and unnatural divorce. Now, similar to Porteous, Burke also thought that enslaved families should be kept intact. If slave traders found that an enslaved person had a spouse or child or other family member on board a slave ship, he said efforts should be made to prevent the family members from being, quote, sold separately. Cohabiting couples with 2 children, Burke added, should have certain privileges and rights conferred upon them on plantations. And this included extra time off at the weekend to see to their own crops. And I'll say more about that in a minute. Now, underlying Burke's plans for slave marriage was a general argument about the beneficial effects that the responsibility of fatherhood would have on those male slaves seeking eventual manumission. So he says at one point, quote, a state of matrimony and the government of a family was a principal means of forming men to a fitness for freedom. But as with elsewhere in Burke's political writings, the encouragement of family was bound up with a concern for social order. So on Burke's plan, marriage is not so much encouraged as commanded, the better to exploit the reproductive capacity of women who might otherwise be unattached. Enslaved men over 20 years old, Burke states, should be, quote, provided with a woman, not having any children living and not exceeding the age of the man. This couple would then be married, he says, publicly in the face of the church. Now, there's 2 things I want to note about this particular marriage scheme that Burke proposes. First, that the marriages in question were compelled rather than voluntary is clear from the Pelham version of Burke's sketch, which stipulated that slaves who refused to marry should be punished either with more work or with what he calls, quote, reduced allowance. So this is the Pelham version of the sketch that's in the British Library. This is a version that was given, we think it's the earliest version of the sketch, and the 2 of the articles are different from the version that was given to Henry Dundas in 1792. And one of these articles is the one I've just mentioned, that where slaves are punished if they will not take a wife. In this, you can see in the document, there's some marginal notes on the left-hand side. The top one there shows that Burke expressed some doubts. These are notes by Burke that expressed doubts about coercing marriage in this way. So he says here that I think some liberal men may possibly object to this compulsion upon the slave. So he recognized that the idea of forcing people into marriages may be objectionable. Second of all, second thing to note, the requirement that the women be supplied to men, that these women be childless and younger, makes clear, to my mind at least, that fertility promotion is a large part of the object here. So Catherine Paw, the historian, has, I think with good reason, called Burke's sketch a, quote, plan for remolding the sex lives of the enslaved in order to promote reproduction. And I think that is, there's a lot to be said for that interpretation. Now, that Burke himself saw the potential of his proposals to increase slave numbers is evidenced by his intervention when abolition returned to the House of Commons for debate in April 1791. So that speech that I mentioned at the start of my talk, that was 1789. In 1791, Burke was making a different sort of argument. So in that debate, Wilberforce had addressed some concern among the MPs that abolishing the slave trade would again adversely impact the stock of slave labor available to West Indian planters. Wilberforce tried to say that, on the contrary, abolishing the trade would bring about a, quote, rapid increase in the slave population, especially if the possibilities for, quote, breeding and rearing slaves domestically could be fully explored. The next day, Burke delivered a speech in which he offered a comparable argument. An improved system of legislation, he said, which I think is an allusion to his own sketch, would produce a, quote, natural increase in the slave population, rendering the trade itself redundant. But because, he said, quote, the Negroes did not yet generally increase by birth, supplies from Africa would be needed for some time to come. So Burke, again, thought of this as a very gradual process, that replacing imported slaves with those born on plantations. Okay, just the third of the topics in Burke's sketch that I want to explore: the system of self-purchase and the path to manumission in Burke's plan. Now, much of the case for regarding Burke's sketch as a plan for emancipation hinges on what he has to say about manumission. So Gregory Collins, in his paper on this topic, plays up very much the potential for slave manumission in this plan. So under the Code Noir, plantation owners were permitted to manumit their slaves for any reason whatsoever, and many did. And this is incidentally one of the reasons why there was a larger free black population in French colonies than in British colonies. There was no such leeway in Britain. British reformers such as Burke preferred a more gradual approach to manumission, one that required slaves to purchase their own freedom over time. Now, the model for such a scheme of self-purchase was Spanish rather than French. So if we look at Joseph Priestley, a sermon on the subject of the slave trade he gave in 1788, he says, the Spanish have made excellent regulations, in consequence of which the slaves can work out their own freedom. Now, although not codified into law until the 19th century, the Spanish system of quartación allowed slaves to negotiate a fixed price for their own manumission with their masters. Masters could then allocate 1 day per week in which the slaves would have to themselves, and in which time they could, if you like, accumulate savings that they could then use to buy a second day, and so on and so forth until the final and full price of manumission was paid. So, and so depending on how quickly the slave could earn money, that's how fast this process would go. And the crucial thing about this is that the price is fixed. So even in a climate of slave inflation, the master is not permitted to change, if you like, shift the goalposts. The price has to remain the same. And there are some cases in the Spanish Empire of courts siding with the enslaved if masters tried to pull that trick. Now, the limited awareness the British reformers had of this scheme was largely due to one man, this fellow you see on your left. This is Granville Sharp. He had published a very influential pamphlet in 1776 called The Just Limitations of Slavery in the Laws of God. And he essentially included an annex to that text, which was essentially describing and praising these Spanish regulations. So Spanish regulations for the gradual enfranchisement of the slaves is what he called them. And so once Granville Sharp publishes this, you start seeing references to these Spanish regulations everywhere in abolitionist literature. But although everyone in the reform movement seemed to be unanimous in proposing some version of these Spanish rules, not all of these of their plans were the same. And I want to just talk about a couple of differences or areas of difference. The two most important areas of difference were concerned eligibility, in other words, who exactly among the enslaved population is eligible to pursue this path to manumission. And then there's the question of what exactly are the property rights of the enslaved, because there is a certain paradox built into the idea that people who are themselves regarded as property can be property owners, right? So the question of who should be eligible distinguished those who saw manumission as a kind of reward for the select few from those who saw it as a vehicle for a more widespread emancipation. So Bell B. Porteous, again, the Bishop of London, he is, I think, put the bar for manumission at the highest. He says that this is a self-emancipation really should only be reserved for the most deserving slaves, those that were sort of hardest working, but also demonstrated best knowledge of Christianity and best Christian practice. Other reformers widened considerably the scope of their emancipation schemes to encompass the entire enslaved population. So Philip Howard commended what he called the Spanish regulations, but then he proposed extending the chance for self-emancipation to any adult born under slavery upon reaching 21 years of age. And so under Howard's scheme, the government, the British state, would essentially purchase the first day that the slave needed to get going towards self-purchase. So they would immediately have, at the public's expense, a day upon hitting 21, and then they could work to purchase a second day, and so on. Now, Howard's use of the term adults implies that women could avail of this provision alongside men. In other cases, the extension of self-emancipation to women was more explicit. So again, that anonymous pamphlet I mentioned before, the Essays Commercial and Political, it stipulated that either male or female slaves could emancipate themselves and then liberate their children or near connections in the same manner. So there it's explicitly men or women that can avail of this. Burke's version of self-emancipation was on the more restrictive end of this spectrum. So in the first place, Burke placed a higher age threshold on self-purchase, and he made marriage and family obligatory. So you can sort of see the importance of marriage and family shining through here for Burke. So only married heads of household older than 30, so rather than 21, it's 30, with 3 children. So it's quite a high bar in terms of family as well. And a certificate of good Christian living that they need to obtain from a cleric. Only these people would be eligible for self-purchase on Burke's scheme. Married women, crucially, could be emancipated only by their husbands, who would essentially purchase them at what Burke called half the market rate. In other words, or they're half their marketable value. So in other words, there's this perverse situation where a husband purchases his own freedom and then continues to earn in order to purchase the freedom of his wife and children. Notice that for unmarried women, there is no route to emancipation at all, right? So on Burke's plan. Moreover, on Burke's scheme, the days granted to the slaves for their own work were distributed according to age and experience rather than purchased in installments. So Burke says that at age 30, married slaves with 2 children could have Saturdays to themselves. Now, this is in addition to Sundays. All of these schemes are deeply imbued with a Christian ethos, and so they take it for granted that slaves should have Sundays off for rest. Under Burke's scheme, at age 30, enslaved men with 2 children could have Saturdays to themselves, but it was only at 37, so 7 years later, that they could then get Friday. So it's not a question of working, paying off some of a fixed fee in order to then get another day. You just have to wait 7 years on Burke's plan. In a marginal note to the Pelham copy of the sketch, so again, there's the Pelham copy in the British Library, Burke signaled awareness of how this differed from Spanish practice. So if you look at the quote here, this is the note. In the Spanish plantations, he says, I understand there is a regulation much in the spirit of his own, but instead of increasing the slave's opportunity of working for himself and so saving money to buy his freedom, they reduce the price of his freedom in proportion to the length of his servitude. So Burke saw, this is one, I think the only piece of written evidence we have where Burke sort of owns up to the influence of Spanish and French, or in this case, Spanish examples on his own thinking. So Burke's plan was thus aligned, he says, in spirit with the Spanish regulations. But I think it's pretty clear that while some reformers saw the Spanish regulations as allowing for what they call a rapid progress towards freedom, Burke's preference was for a slower process. Okay, now, just a word on the kind of property that slaves could accumulate. So this is the other way that these schemes would differ, these schemes of self-purchase. So in some reform proposals, there's no mention of landed property, right? The implication is that the enslaved would accumulate wages on their free days and then use those wages to enable self-purchase. Incidentally, this is one reason why the Quartacion system in the Spanish Empire was often more popular in urban areas, because enslaved people with any kind of free time, there's been much more opportunities for sort of odd jobs and casual work where they could earn wages, more difficult in more rural plantation settings. So some just imagined wages, others were determined that the enslaved be anchored to the plantations they had worked on even as they achieve emancipation. So again, the author of the essays Commercial and Political was pretty indifferent as to whether slaves worked for pay or tilled their own land. But Porteous, and as we'll see, Burke, were adamant that slaves be attached to the soil, that slaves had to be attached to the same portion of land that they had grown up on. So Burke insisted on setting up the enslaved in their own plots of land that he said should be contiguous to the huts that they live in. So almost like a little mini estate. And for Burke, it was important that these land holdings be protected from arbitrary seizure by masters or by anyone else. So even if the master had granted them in the first place, so if it was a bequest from the master, he was not required, or he was not entitled to revoke that later on. In other words, the enslaved acquired real property rights in this scheme. There was, in Burke's mind, no contradiction between upholding the property rights of the master in relation to the slave, while also protecting the slave's right to whatever, quote, land, house, cattle, goods, or money that he had accumulated by his own effort. Now, unsurprisingly, critics of Burke's plan among the plantocracy objected that to grant property rights to the enslaved necessarily infringed upon the property rights of slave owners. So writing to Burke in 1797, this was just before Burke died, his friend and political ally, French Lawrence, reported that the planters were furious and opposed to what Lawrence called the essential part of Burke's plan, which is what he called the connection of the slave with the soil, his consequent right to the spot once assigned to him and around his hut, and his right to purchase his freedom at a certain fixed price. It was only by implementing this portion of Burke's plan that it would accomplish its overall purpose, which Lawrence confirmed as the gradual abolition of slavery as well as the slave trade. So it's interesting that Burke's friend French Lawrence, who would have known him quite well, he takes it for granted that Burke's plan has this ultimately in view, the abolition of both the trade and the institution. But let me just wrap up by referring to another letter that sits in contrast with that one from French Lawrence. So when Burke finally sent his sketch to Dundas, Henry Dundas in 1792, a member of the government and someone who was in favor of reforming the trade rather than abolishing it, Burke accompanied it with a letter that made clear that his preference, at least in 1792, was for the reform of the trade rather than its abolition. He was now, he says, fully convinced that the cause of humanity would be far more benefited by the continuation of the trade and servitude, regulated and reformed, than by the total destruction of both or either. The slave trade, to Burke, remained a blemish on Britain's collective character, but so long as the institution existed, he now judged, the most prudent and humane course of action was to regulate the trade in a manner that would lessen the suffering of the enslaved and keep the planter class in check, and thus preserving the stability of the empire. So whatever Burke might have intended for it in 1780, and I sympathize with the idea that he might have had ultimately abolition in view, he designed the sketch to be flexible enough that it could be redirected to a more reformist direction without amendment at all. And that, I think, is what Burke intended. That is in keeping, I think, with Burke's style of political argument, that flexibility be inbuilt. Thank you very much. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. Can you all join me in thanking Ross for his talk as we, I'm going to end the, can you end your screen sharing so I can see all the people again? Sorry. Great. Thank you so much. Can we all give our thanks? And we had so much pre-talk flummery. We have slightly less time for questions, but I can keep this room open as long as people have questions they'd like to pose. So either raise your hand or post something in the Zoom. Andrea Haslinger has a question. Andrea, would you like to unmute and ask?
Yes, hi, thanks for that talk. I didn't know about that Burke, and so I've learned a lot more about that dimension of Burke. So my question is about the law and the kind of presumed benevolence of law. But let me say something quickly before I get to the question. I've started to read this new book called Black Ghost of Empire by the historian Chris Manjapra. You may know it. I don't know all of the argument, but it's basically saying to assume that the kind of abolition acts or the telos of anti-slavery is a mistake, right? So seeing that as an inflection point of the history of enslavement is a mistake because of the continuation of racist ideas that are enshrined in law even after abolition, right? And it strikes me that that's interestingly maybe in dialogue with the approach you're taking to Burke and his ameliorationist views, which remain kind of intensely paternalistic. So that way of thinking about the history of enslavement seems incredibly helpful. That this is not about abolition as a kind of telos. My question about your kind of discussion of the, I suppose, kind of English admiration for the Code Noir, which I wasn't really familiar with, is about how you would characterize Burke and maybe other political philosophers' attitudes toward the law as at once a kind of, I don't know, protector of freedom and rights, a kind of benevolent vehicle, but at the same time, a way of, to take a more kind of 20th, 21st century view on it, a way of legitimating violence, extrajudicial violence, and so on. Sorry, that's a big question, but just, about the law and the assumed benevolence of the law.
Thank you. That's a terrific question. So yes, I mean, I think for a lot of for these reformers, they kind of saw the British slave trade, or the British corner of the slave trade, as a kind of regulatory Wild West, right? So they saw it as lawless, and they kind of they sort of said, well, this is a repugnant practice to begin with, but it's even worse when it's unregulated, and so a lot of them did have a very benevolent view of law, or at least they saw law as benevolent. And even though, I mean, I think some of them probably recognized that once you enshrine something in law, then you're going to give it a kind of permanence, right? It's going to, as you say, be legitimated. So one of the reasons why, for example, Burke's, this piece of legislation I mentioned at the start of my talk, the Free Ports Act, one of the reasons why that was so controversial is that it actually created the legal precedent, or enshrined in British law, the notion that Africans could be merchandise. Right, because because once then that is stated in law, it's very difficult then to sort of overturn it or to pretend that the things are otherwise. And indeed, this is one of the other arguments that Burke, in the abolitionist speech he gave in 1789, that another argument he had to refute was that, well, Parliament has authorized the slave trade. These companies the Royal African Company are operating under a legal charter. Parliament cannot then all of a sudden whip the rug from under the company and declare what they're doing illegal. And Burke kind of, as a good parliamentarian who believed in sort of parliamentary sovereignty, he says, no, what Parliament has given, Parliament can take away. That Parliament can revoke earlier authorization easily. But you're absolutely right. They sort of, I think, some of them, they saw law as just as always a step in the right direction. For us, it looks a bit more sinister for the reasons you've described, because it is sort of lending a kind of legitimacy to this practice, which is just fundamentally wrong, right? So, and I think the other thing to say about this is that Burke, in part of the sketch that I didn't discuss, mentions that we need to regulate the trade in order to avoid an illicit market in slaves, right? So he was worried that if we don't actually regulate it, you're going to get a lot more, people being captured in places like Ghana and brought to the coast and sent off into slavery. Is if we can sort of regulate it, we can at least limit it to certain slave markets and so on, and make it more sort of benevolent. But then, as you say, that is really just it lends a gloss of legitimacy to the trade itself, and it pretends that there can be a licit version of the slave trade, and that, I think, is the danger here with a lot of these a lot of these reform proposals. But I absolutely share your perspective that that there is no telos here, and you can abolish the slave trade and still believe in the continuation of slavery, as I think many of these reformers did. They kind of thought the continuation of some form of servitude was inevitable, and indeed they were trying to convince skeptics that, look, we can abolish the trade and your plantations will still be safe because you can replace imports with homegrown slaves.
Great. I'm going to just let Carrie ask a question before we completely run out of time.
Oh, sure. I'll try to make it quick. Kind of building off of that, of course, there were, Ottobah Cugoano certainly saw it as sinister, right? And that sinister nature of the pretense to having a moral, a legal, or even a philosophical argument about the enslavability of Africans was, of course, not lost on him. And he, of course, says that the justification is actually because of finance, right, not commerce. It's not, the sale of sugar, right, that perpetuates slavery. It's the fact that all of these trade companies that stopped being trade companies, as Smith writes, and then became financiers, not even of slavery, but of influence on the government, right? That they're buying parliamentary seats, that they are, that the Bank of England was 200% GDP in debt to these, financiers of slavery. That's what Cugoano sees in the system that I feel like kind of gets lost in these discussions about whether, and in what degree there is a legitimate moral, legal, or philosophical claim being made. Bentham also calls it out. Bentham calls it out in Spain, in France, and in England. He sees all three of these, systems of slavery as being perpetuated by a financial interest that perverts philosophical and moral and legal authority. And so, of course, there were people criticizing these systems at the time, as well as the example of the Quakers, right, who, as Burke and Carey writes, their attempts at amelioration failed because amelioration always leads to abolition, right? Like you can't ameliorate an intolerable system without empowering people to advocate for themselves even more efficiently. And so I think like that's I think part of this. It's very aggravating, as I'm sure you've found in your reading, to read these purported moral, legal, and philosophical claims that are obviously perverted by financial interests and debts. And so I wonder if you kind of get into the financial part of that, the kind of obligations that somebody who is a member of parliament or somebody who may himself be in debt to these financiers have in perpetuating atrocities.
That's a brilliant point. So to me, the really interesting point of contrast here is the East India Company. Yeah. Which of course Burke spends a huge part of his later career castigating, right? So he makes exactly the point you just made there, that the East India Company begins as a trading enterprise and ends up just being a system of asset stripping. Like it just, and it becomes a conquering sovereign. So he says that this is no longer in any way engaged in a commercial, because commerce, of course, he reads as Montesquieu, right? He has the douce commerce kind of thesis. So he thinks of commerce as a benevolent, civilizing, wonderful thing. But he just says the East India Company are not engaged in that anymore. They might have been at one point, but now they're just rapacious. But he doesn't seem to make this connection over to the Royal African Company. Like, why not? Because it seems like, and you could argue that this is just racism, right? That for whatever reason, Burke, because of a certain Orientalist view, sees Indian civilization as this sort of marvelous, exotic but powerful and sublime thing, and he just doesn't see that in Africa. So therefore, he just doesn't see the problem with what the Royal African Company is doing. So that's one reason for the discrepancy. But it is nevertheless kind of puzzling, because he's all over what you've described when it comes to India. He sees exactly what's going on with also the influx of all of this financial capital back into Britain. As you say, the buying of MPs. He sees Hastings as having basically a lot of parliament in his pocket, and this is the old Republican argument, this corrupts the domestic state. So yeah, it is a curious discrepancy. And I think what Burke writes on Africa is there's 3 volumes of writings on India. There's only really the sketch and a few other fragments on Africa. So it's a little harder to speculate about what Burke knew about the Royal African Company and why he didn't extend that critique there.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I know that it's marking season and that it's also school pickup time here in the UK. So unless there's any final questions, can I just ask everyone to give a final show of appreciation to Ross? And we will please join us again next month as our summer season carries on. Thank you all for making time to pop into Zoom today, and I hope to see you all next month. Thank you and goodbye.